Welcome to Inside Line. Justin Harrison returns. Tom Deason here as well, and a very big Inside Line warm welcome to Michael Cheika, our special guest. Check, great to have you back on Stan Sport, back talking some rugby. We're going to dive into a few of the big topics in the game at the moment. We'll get to where you're at and what's next at some point in this show. But we've discussed at length previously Regulation 9 and the ability to select players for your nation if they play overseas, which is a big talking point in Australia because in recent years, we've started to open that gate a little bit, but it's reared its head again recently with Will Skelton and now desire, fans, coaches, etc., to have him involved in the Wallabies. And at the moment, there's a bit of a tug-of-war is how it feels, and he's returning back to La Rochelle. I think it's important and a great opportunity for us with you here. What experience have you had with having to manage that relationship between national team and a club to release players for national duty?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me here. Appreciate it. I'm looking forward to the discussion. Mate, I think, obviously, just so people understand, Rule 9 allows players to be available for all World Rugby windows, right? So the reality is if Australia wants to pick Will Skelton, they can pick him, and La Rochelle can't say anything about it. So the issue is coming down to probably Will's initial intention when he went over. And this was always brought about by teams bringing players over and telling them, you're coming here to play in Europe, but we don't want you playing international rugby and we'll give you lots of money, or big O money, right? So I think that dealing with the clubs is the main director of how that will go will be the player. If the player has gone over there with the intention of sort of committing to that club and not thinking too much about international football, moving away from international football, he can't make that agreement in writing, but he can make that agreement spiritually. And therefore, if you talk to the player and he says, look, this is what I've done, etc., which I imagine is what's happening with Will, you try to find the balance in amongst that. And of course, the only way you can really do anything about that is apply your own market pressure, I'd imagine, by trying to offer that player the same amount of money or a certain amount of money to bring them back to Australia to play.
That's been going on for donkey's years though, Check. Like, I remember writing about Adam Ashley Cooper. I think he played at Bledisloe in 2016 and you guys were trying to get him for the rest of the TRC, but Bordeaux basically said no. Like, theoretically, what happens there? Like, are you on the phone literally to the director? Is it a CEO thing? Do you speak in French to woo them over?
The first is the player, right? So let's say in that instance, I don't recall that instance, but anyway, let's say Adam says, Check, I really want to play, but the club's giving me grief, you know what I mean? So I might go there and try and manoeuvre the club or talk to the club and say, listen, here's maybe a plan of if we want him for a particular game, release him for a game, because at the end of the day, the trade-off is this. I can make that player come and play. If he wants to play for Australia, we can call him, right? He can be called, unless he retires. Now, at that point, but you don't want to put that player's career or contract in jeopardy, right? So the reality is you try to make it work according to the scenario of each player, which is different. And I think that it's a skill to try to pick, first of all, which games you want to have that player for, and also there's so many things involved. There's salary pressure, Justin, like, okay, we can offset some of this player's salary overseas but still have them play for Australia. But there's a lot of moving pieces that you've got to try and connect and then go to the player and the club and talk about. But it's direct line. I would have spoken to owners, coaches, depending on who the conversation is with, to try and get them feel like, okay, because I don't think it's as much the player missing a game here or there, it's the injury possibility. Because if that player gets injured and then he's out for 12 weeks, 16 weeks, there's a real net effect there for the club.
I think also it's the macro issue of every party entering these arrangements with their eyes wide open, right? So you can't have sporadic squad selection for a resource that's overseas. You need to have a 12-month calendar laid out with these clubs, understanding now, let's call it the Cheika rule back, when your eligibility came into it. So there's never been a hard and fast policy. And what you don't want to do, exactly right, Check, is compromise the player's relationship with their employer. It's not fair to ask the player to make a choice between they're satisfying the employment conditions of a contract that's binding and a REM structure that's pretty rigid and pretty clear, and make that decision to not have to play for the ultimate honour was their national team, right? So World Rugby needs to probably, this is a healthy opportunity. Talent is moving around the world more than ever. People are engaged, players are engaged in different models all around the world, and we want access to the premier market for the national product. We know how valuable that is to the game of World Rugby. World Rugby need to lean in, re-examine Regulation 9 and stop obligating players at ground level to take propositions to their employer and then compromise potentially the longevity of their employment.
Yeah, but mate, as far what World Rugby will say to you, well, Reg 9 is the rule to stop that, because it's about, you know how you say eyes wide open, transparent. Most of the players who have gone overseas from here, maybe the current lot are different, but that era of Will, guys like that, they went there going, well, I'm probably not going to play for Australia here.
Because at the time they couldn't.
They couldn't. And we brought in the 60 capper.
There was no rule. There was just the coach at the time what he wanted, and you circumnavigated the 60 cap rule.
For the World Cup.
There was no rule, right?
No. The rule was no one had ever been brought back from overseas to play.
Right.
So the initial negotiations were myself speaking with, I think, Michael Hawker or whoever was in charge at that time, the early time there, and then starting that whole process with the CEO, with Bill Pulver, etc. And we had specific targeted players in mind of who we wanted to come back for a certain reason. So you're in a bit of a transition phase, but I think for the future, if you can set that clarity up, if you go and what the framework is from an Australian point of view of this is how we want to set this up. We do want to relieve some wage pressure perhaps and let players play overseas if that's what they want to do. But we've got to have some clarity on how many games this player goes. So when they go to their negotiation, they speak to their agent who goes into those clubs overseas. There's absolute clarity of they'll be playing for Australia X amount of times a year if selected. Yeah, I've obviously lived this as well with Argentina, where the Reg 9 affects them totally differently than it does for Australia.
Can you tell us that? Because it does, this might be very myopic, but it does feel like this affects Australia a lot. And I know it affects the Pacific Island nations, but the other Tier 1 nations, it doesn't feel like it affects them as much. If you look at South Africa, a lot is said about how many foreign-based players they have, but they seem to have access to them whenever and wherever they like.
Well, their players definitely go over there with telling the clubs that they're going to be playing for South Africa and they're making their available. I think that's a real difference, whereas for ours it was a bit of an unsaid law, whereas theirs it wasn't open. It was always open to go over there. We'll pick you from over there, but you have to have clarity with the club that you can come back overseas. Because I've never really heard, I don't know about you, Justin, I've never really heard issues for French in the French league or in the English league with the South African players going back. Now with also their presence in the URC, which is a European competition, they're able to have players at home and they're all playing on the same time zone. This is why it doesn't affect, say, it affects Argentina more, because they're playing international rugby in the southern hemisphere and club rugby in the northern hemisphere. So it's even more complex for them, the Rule 9 situation.
I mean, Australia has a market product like Super Rugby Pacific, a compelling reason to stay and continue development. Now, when you outstrip the capacity of that Super Rugby to meet market demands around contract valuation, that's when you start to think about offloading balance sheet frailty. Argentina don't have necessarily a cogent professional competition that's going to necessarily develop those players into the sort of condition and IP and status that Czech would have looked for when he's putting together a team capable of winning a TRC.
They are bringing, just sorry to interrupt, they are building Super Rugby Americas now, where there are players coming and playing for Argentina direct from those teams, and it's becoming a nursery for foreign clubs. I see probably 12 or 13 players that have played in Super Rugby Americas last season have taken up European contracts. And if you see what's happening even there, under-20s players are being brought into academies in France, for example, so that they can qualify as what they call GIF. So even though they are eligible to play for Argentina, they can still qualify as a local player because they've served X amount of years in the academy of that French team. So therefore, it's even another way of manoeuvring the pieces. So it is, like you say, a moving feast around what the rules and regulations are. So a really coherent strategy as far as what Australia decides to do in relation to opening up. How do we bring them? Who do we want back here? Who do we want over there? How many games will they play? Is, I would imagine, part of the course, and what probably the director of rugby is doing right now is probably laying out what that looks like for all players that are overseas.
Are World Rugby in any way washing their hands of this a little bit? Because if you read Regulation 9, the wording in there is very clear, as you said before, Check, is that it's the international game is absolutely in the best interests of the game as a whole, and no club or union can ever stop a player or contract a player or have any agreement that stops them playing within a window. But as has been discussed, it feels like World Rugby sit back a little bit and go, oh, we've written it, we don't have any evidence that it's happening.
Well, there's a point where a playground dust-up needs to stay in the playground, and you have it out. At the moment, you can't keep running back to the principle, right? So World Rugby can't manage the minutiae of relationships necessary to wade into every disagreement. What my point around macro issues is that, we still have an unsolved conflict in North v South calendar alignment, TRC moving to Six Nations. There's a lot of levers and pressure points that get taken off the table if we start to get an alignment of season structure and commerciality and aggregation. I don't think they're washing their hands of it. They've thought long and hard, and it's consistently under examination. If you talk about legacies and reasons for being elected, we are taking the game forward and we're going to change the way the game is thought about. Our Australian Heritage Chairman, Brett Robinson, has a great opportunity to really examine that, get some people in the room that have experienced that firsthand, have firsthand knowledge, cough, cough, Michael Cheika, and have a look at some case studies and examine how that can work better for all parties. It's not going to be without imperfection, because ultimately everyone walks away from an imperfect agreement, but we move forward. At the moment, the game seems to be developing some inertia around flow of talent and use of talent and commensurate valuation of it.
If Czech gets an advisory role with World Rugby, do you get a clip
I definitely
get a percentage?
I definitely get something.
You're almost into the
Do you need an
heresy
agent?
type talk there, me and World Rugby in the same voice.
Yeah, well,
but,
Be an unholy union, that's for sure.
One thing's really interesting, there is a real pressure time point, right? And it's like now, coming into the new season. So November's pretty sweet because they're playing in November as well. They're off. Most of the French tournament's definitely off, etc. So Australian players should be fine to play in November. Go on, you want to?
I'm just saying, I just feel for the fans. Like anyone who is supporting the Wallabies over the last couple of weeks thinks, I'm going to buy my tickets this week to watch Australia play Argentina, and Will Skelton's not going to be there. Now, at the moment, he's not going to be playing against Argentina. As Ian reported, that's up in the air for Bledisloe. Those talks are ongoing. So I just feel for the fan who's a bit confused by what seems to be a rule for some days and others not.
I want to throw, and this is a loaded question, I accept that, but and tell me if I'm
loading
way
a question before it's loaded. How good?
Yeah, well, double barrel here, because there is a sentiment within people who govern the game, particularly in Australia. I know that, but there's a sentiment within fans as well that the French Rugby Union or French clubs are holding the international game at ransom, because a lot of the time it feels like it's the French clubs that are stopping or withholding players from going and represent their nation. You mentioned the GIF situation with young players who get contracted to French clubs and they end up becoming eligible that way. It's happened recently with Australia. Now it's happened with Pacific Island nations for a long time. Is there a sense that the French are somewhat putting their own domestic game and probably secondary their own national team ahead of the international game?
Well, you've got to understand the difference between a right and a negotiation and a hard policy, right? So where is your entry point into the discussion? What are the resources and the contribution that you're making to your own ecosystem as well as the game of World Rugby? World Rugby policy talks about growing the game and fair and equitable negotiations and reasonable person, which is a legal definition as well. So fair and reasonable, you start there. I don't think LNR and French rugby are the demon in this equation. I think that what we have is a lot of colliding planets at the moment. We have a whole of game that is under pressure commercially. And we have still the very people that are responsible for growing the game put under the most pressure, which is the player, ultimately, and staff now too. by the way. Staff are in this picture as much. They're obligated to move hemispheres to find jobs and create livelihoods for themselves as well. So it's not only player-centric, but we are still putting everything we can into this resource, and the whole of game is dependent on that, but we have it in an imperfect structure at the moment that is in conflict with itself. We have competitions that conflict with itself. We have regulations that are able to have trapdoors in them and conveniently be misinterpreted. So, and we have tier 2, tier and different levels of competition. Until we sort that out, and that is a big moving piece, but it is not an impossible task. So LNR absolutely have financial clout and weight of numbers, top 14. You've seen it, Pro D2, top 14. They contribute. Of course, they have a right to do some things because they contribute an enormous amount of resource to the game of rugby. They absolutely contribute to Australian player development, right?
They're the market
we learn
leaders
on
in
that.
world rugby, mate. Their entrepreneurship in the way that they've been able to manage an independent private league that's owned independently from the federation, work in harmony with the federation, create depth inside of their clubs, create a multi-tier competition, have the biggest rugby economy inside of their club competition. They're building an economy. They have billionaire owners, high salary caps. They've got restrictions as well that are very strong financially. So they're global leaders in relation to how they run their league, and therefore what's happening now is their international team is benefiting from the way that league is being run. And I think that there's no way that we should be looking to restrict them whatsoever. We should be looking to embrace them and how can we benefit from being part of that ecosystem as well.
There's no doubt things that the rest of the world rugby could learn, but if the French are also sending inverted commas B teams on Southern Hemisphere tours in the middle of the year, isn't that sort of to the
team?
Depends how your B team performs, mate.
Well,
their B team performs pretty good.
They did perform well, but I guess also to Tom's point, wanting to see the best French players come out and play in New Zealand or Australia in 2021.
The World Rugby will get that when they decide to go global calendar. When the global calendar's done, all the best players will be playing everywhere, but they won't take that step.
Those players will have played over nearly 50 games if they go on the whole of season participation in top 14, then into Test rugby. So, Will Skelton's of the world as well. Oh, yeah. There is absolutely a physical... You'll shorten a player's career markedly if you continue to go year on year back to back. So, and Australia's done it as well. We've rested players in end of year November tours, Sharpie Creek, Rockstars, so it's not a foreign concept, is it?
Yeah, Argentina had to rest players. They're playing 12 months of the year against England in the tour just there. Cost them points, but they needed to do it so they could perform in the Rugby Championship. So I think that that can be... I think France is, like we were talking about, the way that the league works. I think it should be, rewarded for what it brings, and it should be looked at as very entrepreneurial, and that we can come around and have all those players available if they decide to go with a global calendar. But at the moment, the politics is restricting that. Thus, the entrepreneurship of the game is struggling a little bit at that level, and therefore you'll get shootouts like this rebel comp that they're talking about, or more and more of that will get talked about as long as they don't make a change there.